There is an invisible point where everything we are rests in silence, even before any thought is born. It is the field where consciousness touches the quantum fabric of existence, and every human emotion reveals itself as a vibration that alters matter. Humanity, distracted by the surface of the visible, has forgotten this ocean of potency that dwells within it. Yet there are moments when something awakens, a flicker that makes the body tremble, as if reality itself were whispering, "There is more." It is in this interval between the known and the mystery that the lost link manifests, calling each being to remember that infinity is not outside, but pulses at the core of every breath. The day begins like any other. The body awakens, the clock dictates the rhythm, and yet something inside remains still, like a string vibrating in silence. The smile adjusts to the face, the commitments follow their script, but behind each gesture there is a distance between who one is and what one lives. This dissonance is not sadness, nor discouragement. It is a subtle presence that questions without words whether everything that has been built truly corresponds to what pulses deep within the being. Emptiness seeps through the intervals of routine. It does not demand attention. It simply insists on existing. It arises when success brings no relief, when love is not enough, when rest does not silence the inner noise. It is a vibration that refuses explanations, for it is not born from the lack of something external, but from disconnection with the invisible flow that animates every particle of existence. The body moves, but the energy feels scattered, as if part of us had remained in some forgotten point in time. On the surface, the world remains the same, but within, a silent field begins to open, inviting perception to see what the eyes cannot capture. This emptiness is the trace of the quantum field operating within human experience. It manifests when consciousness senses that visible reality is only a fraction of a much vaster whole. The feeling of lack is, in truth, the echo of an ancient memory, the call to return to the original coherence, where thought, emotion, and energy danced in harmony. Quantum physics describes the vacuum as a space full of possibilities, not absence. Particles appear and disappear in a constant play of creation, as if the universe were breathing between being and non-being. The same principle governs the inner space. The emptiness one feels is not a void, but a field in latency, energy awaiting the moment when consciousness will once again observe it. The pain of those who miss something undefined is the field trying to be recognized. The discomfort is the prelude to remembrance. When the human being tries to ignore this vibration, seeking to anesthetize themselves with noise, achievements, or certainties, emptiness turns into anguish, coherence unravels, energy fragments, and meaning seeps through the cracks of haste. The mind struggles to find answers, but emptiness does not respond to logic. It asks for presence. What appears to be absence is, in truth, the space where the universe tries to communicate with consciousness. Emptiness is fertile. It contains the potential of all that has yet to be manifested, but fear of silence makes us want to fill it. We create noise, opinions, goals, promises, without realizing that the more we avoid it, the more it expands. It is like trying to silence the ocean with a whisper. Only when one allows oneself to listen without resistance does something transform. Energy, once scattered, begins to reorganize. Emptiness reveals itself as the meeting point between the human and the field. Some confuse this space with loneliness, but they are of different natures. Loneliness is born of separation. Emptiness, of vastness. The first isolates, the second integrates. When one surrenders to emptiness, they discover they are not alone. They are immersed in a living field that responds to observation. The heart, once restless, realizes that the lack was never of something, but of attunement. It is at that moment that silence ceases to be a threat and becomes a portal. The ancients called this state the remembrance of origin. Science recognizes it as energetic coherence. In both cases, it is realignment. Emptiness acts as a quantum mirror, reflecting not what we are on the surface, but what we have forgotten to be. And when observation becomes pure, without judgment, this mirror begins to return the whole image, the being connected to the field, capable of creating reality from consciousness. Nothing extraordinary happens outside. Transformation occurs when one accepts remaining within their own silence. At that point, time loses its rigidity. The boundaries between matter and energy become permeable. Emptiness fills with presence. A subtle sensation arises that something has reorganized effortlessly, as if the universe had breathed along. The heart expands, not from euphoria, but from recognition. The body perceives that the inner space is the same space where the cosmos moves. Emptiness then ceases to be an enemy. It reveals itself as the language of the field, as the matrix of new possibilities. Each time the being embraces it, a particle of reality is reconfigured. What was once discomfort becomes creative force. The search ceases, and in the place of lack arises the perception of wholeness. The feeling of incompleteness, so feared, was only the field calling back what has always belonged to infinity. True fulfillment does not come from what is achieved, but from what is recognized. And what is recognized, when the gaze turns inward, is the same field that sustains galaxies, stars, and thoughts. Absence reveals itself as presence. Emptiness becomes the origin of meaning. At that moment, the being understands. Nothing is missing. They were merely remembering through pain something that has always lived within, the field where everything is born, vibrates, and returns. The deepest pain rarely screams. It hides in the way the shoulders weigh for no apparent reason, in the gaze that avoids the mirror, in the breath that shortens when remembering what could have been. It is a pain with no visible wound, a tension the body carries for years, shaping postures, decisions, and silences. It arises when life becomes functional but not vital, when the external movement continues, but the interior becomes static. This pain is not punishment, it is a signal, a reminder that the energy that constitutes us is disconnected from the source that nourishes it. Every human being is a vibrational field. Science has already shown that cells communicate not only through chemical reactions, but also through subtle electromagnetic frequencies. When emotion is repressed, the field contracts. When thought becomes repetitive, it generates noise, interfering with the natural coherence of the energetic system. This disharmony manifests in the body as persistent fatigue, in the emotions as apathy, and in the mind as confusion. Disconnection does not happen in one blow. It installs itself slowly, as the being forgets to listen to itself. Some live decades like this, fulfilling duties, smiling automatically, believing everything is fine, while inside, the vital flow has been reduced to a thin thread. The energy that once expanded freely in every gesture begins to circulate only enough to keep the body standing. And what the world calls maturity is often just the soul's adaptation to a state of numbness. This silent pain cannot be resolved with distractions, because it does not arise from what happens outside, but from the distance between what we are and what we express. The modern mind, conditioned by material logic, has learned to distrust the invisible. Everything that cannot be measured is dismissed, but the energetic essence cannot be measured. It is felt. It communicates through sudden intuitions, chills, pulses in the chest, synchronicities that repeat until they are noticed. Ignoring these signals is like cutting the threads that connect us to the field. The consequence is the emptying of meaning, not because life has lost value, but because the channel of perception has been blocked. When disconnection deepens, the body tries to compensate. It seeks in food, pleasure, or excessive activity a substitute for the vital energy that no longer circulates. But no external stimulus can reproduce the vibration of genuine connection with the field. The result is a fatigue that rest cannot cure, for it is not physical, it is vibrational. The body sleeps, but consciousness remains exhausted. What is called stress is often only energy trying to pass through the mind's resistances to remind us who we are. There comes a moment when the pain ceases to be merely uncomfortable and becomes unbearable. It is when the soul begins to knock harder at the door. Symptoms multiply, irritation without reason, sadness without cause, an inexplicable urge to change everything. The mind resists, trying to restore the old balance, but something inside already knows that the old no longer serves. This friction between the old and the new field of consciousness is the threshold of transformation. Suffering is not the enemy. It is a language. Silent pain is the way the quantum field has found to signal that energy has stagnated. When one begins to observe it with presence, without wanting to get rid of it immediately, something moves. The field responds to conscious attention. The simple act of breathing deeply and acknowledging what is felt opens cracks in vibrational rigidity. Energy begins to flow again, first in small waves, then in more stable currents. The body perceives and gives thanks. Pain becomes a teacher. This reconnection is not mystical, it is natural. Quantum physics describes a principle called coherence, when particles vibrate in harmony, forming ordered patterns of energy. The same occurs within consciousness. When thought, emotion, and body enter coherence, pain dissolves because energy flows again in an integral way. Healing, therefore, does not come from outside but from the restoration of this inner alignment. However, the mind fears the silence where reconnection happens. It prefers the noise of constant seeking, for there it remains in control. That is why, often, the reunion with the energetic essence begins with a collapse, a loss, a forced pause, an exhaustion that demands stopping. These moments, which seem destructive, are in fact recalibration points. The field needs space to reorganize information. When resistance ceases, the system self-adjusts. By recognizing pain without judgment, the being becomes the observer of their own field. In that instant, a new perception arises. The energy that once seemed lost never ceased to exist. It merely fragmented among identities and stories. Every memory, every fear, every imprisoned belief is a fragment of that original energy seeking to return to wholeness. The process of reconnection is, therefore, a gathering of oneself, a retrieval of the parts scattered throughout the journey. Silent pain becomes a compass. It points to where energy needs to be seen, felt, and reintegrated. The more one allows oneself to feel without identifying with suffering, the more the field harmonizes. The heart, the center of resonance between the visible and the invisible, begins to vibrate with new intensity. The breath deepens, time slows, and a sense of clarity settles. Living disconnected from one's own energetic essence is like trying to dance without music. The movement happens, but the meaning is lost. When reconnection begins, there is no spectacle, only presence. The body becomes a finely tuned instrument of the field once again. The pain that once limited transforms into a frequency of expansion. And what once seemed like failure reveals itself as the exact mechanism that led the being back to the point where it all began, the center where consciousness and energy are one vibration. The impulse to control is born from the fear of disappearing into chaos. From an early age, the human being learns to build structures to protect themselves from uncertainty. Plans, goals, identities, narratives. The mind specializes in predicting, anticipating, managing, as if the flow of life were a system that could be conducted by sheer willpower. For a time, this seems to work. Control gives the feeling of mastery, of stability, of security. But little by little, something begins to crack. The constant effort is tiring, and what once seemed like power turns into a prison. Control is a sophisticated form of resistance to the field. Quantum reality is not static. It pulses in waves of probability, always in motion. Trying to fix life into definitive forms is like trying to hold back the wind with your hands. The result is exhaustion and frustration, because the nature of the universe is change, and human consciousness is part of this dance. When one tries to dominate the flow, energy loses coherence. The body stiffens, the mind becomes repetitive, and the heart disconnects from the subtle intelligence the field offers at every moment. The desire for control is born from an illusion that the future can be guaranteed by the force of planning. Modern physics, however, shows the opposite. At the quantum level, the observer influences the outcome, but does not define it in a linear way. There is participation, not dominion. The universe responds to intention with resonance, not with obedience. Each attempt to force a path creates vibrational resistance, and this resistance translates into a sense of limitation. That is why the more the individual tries to adjust everything to their own way, the more life seems to slip through their fingers. Control is the opposite of trust. When the mind believes it can only be safe if it predicts every step, the body enters a state of constant vigilance. The nervous system stays on alert, and the flow of vital energy contracts. The internal quantum field, which should remain open to exchange and creation, becomes a closed structure. In this state, reality narrows. Possibilities diminish not because the universe has stopped offering paths, but because consciousness has stopped seeing them. Limitation, therefore, does not come from the world, but from the way the world is observed. The effort to control blocks the field's spontaneous intelligence, the one that organizes events in an invisible way, moving encounters, intuitions, and synchronicities with mathematical precision. When the human being tries to assume this role, they create interference. It is like trying to conduct an orchestra whose instruments are already playing in perfect harmony. The noise is born from the attempt to impose rhythm on what already has its own beat. There is a subtle difference between directing and controlling. To direct is to align intention with the field's vibration, allowing it to manifest in an organic way. To control is to force the field to fit within the mind's expectations. The first movement flows, the second hardens. In control, there is fear. In directing, there is presence. And presence is the state in which the universe operates with the greatest precision. The human being tries to control because they fear the emptiness between one event and another. This space of not knowing is unbearable for the conditioned mind. However, it is precisely there that the field reorganizes itself. The silence between actions is the universe's laboratory, the interval where particles reconstruct reality. Those who cannot bear the interval live on the edge of exhaustion. Those who welcome it discover that the field works in favor of balance, not against it. The need to control is also the attempt to avoid loss. The mind believes it can keep what it loves and prevent what it fears. But the field does not understand possession. It understands frequency. When something moves away, it is because the vibration has changed. When something approaches, it is because the energetic pattern has aligned. Pain arises when the ego tries to maintain connections that the field has already dissolved, or to prevent movements that the field needs to carry out. Loss, seen this way, is not punishment, but quantum adjustment. Control offers the illusion of security, but it comes at a high cost. It steals life's freshness. The unexpected, which is the field's language, becomes a threat. The human being begins to bargain with time, trying to predict every bend in the river, forgetting that the river only reveals its nature to those who surrender to the current. Surrender, in this context, is not giving up. It is attunement. It is the recognition that there is an intelligence greater than the mind operating through everything, including the misalignments. The loss of control is the beginning of freedom. When the individual finally grows tired of carrying the world on their shoulders and lets go, something invisible aligns. The body relaxes, the breath deepens, and energy begins to circulate again. In this state, the field responds with clarity. What once seemed chaotic reorganizes, and the sense of limitation dissolves. The universe does not punish control. It merely waits for consciousness to trust again. At some point, everyone realizes that life was never under personal dominion. The heart beats without being commanded. The sun rises without orders, and time flows without permission. Existence itself is a sequence of events sustained by something that escapes human will. True freedom begins when this evidence is recognized. There is no weakness in letting go of control. There is intelligence. Because letting go is allowing the field to do what it has always known how to create balance from the interaction between energy, intention, and presence. When the effort to control turns into weariness, the being is ready for the lesson the field has in store. Loss, which once seemed like a threat, becomes a portal. The limit reveals itself as an illusion, and the instant control dissolves, a serene force arises. not the force of dominion, but of communion with the flow. It is at this point that the universe and consciousness once again become a single movement, without imposition, without fear, only pure vibration toward infinity. The fear of not fulfilling a purpose is a shadow that silently accompanies most awakened consciousnesses. It manifests in the intervals between one objective and another, on nights when the body rests, but the mind insists on revisiting its own paths. There is a discomfort that cannot be explained in words, a sense of being off course even when everything seems on track. The material world offers concrete parameters to measure success, but the soul works with another metric, vibrational coherence. And when the two scales come into conflict, the sense of failure arises, not because something was lost, but because consciousness moved away from its own frequency. Material logic teaches that purpose is an achievement, something reached through merit, planning, and effort. This belief creates a linear journey where each step is judged by its usefulness in relation to a final destination. But the quantum field does not operate linearly. In it, purpose is not a line, it is a frequency. One does not arrive at it by displacement, but by tuning. And while the mind seeks concrete results, the field only responds to the vibration emitted in the now. Thus, the anxiety of getting there is, paradoxically, what keeps us from arriving. The fear of not fulfilling purpose is the reflection of a disconnection between being and doing. When action is born of fear, it produces movement without direction. Energy disperses into tasks, goals, and performances that feed the image but not the essence. The body executes, the mind calculates, but the heart remains absent. This absence is the emptiness of purpose. The being acts, but does not vibrate, achieves, but does not feel fulfilled. And each victory becomes just another reminder that something essential remains distant. Quantum science reveals that reality responds to the state of observation, not to effort. The universe does not recognize intentions masked by fear. It vibrates in the language of coherence. When consciousness operates in dissonance, seeking out of need, affirming out of lack, the field returns that same frequency in the form of incomplete experiences. Material logic, by reducing purpose to a measurable result, disconnects the being from the creative force that inhabits them. Purpose is not the destination of the journey, it is the way one walks through it. Living trapped in material logic is like trying to translate a symphony into numbers. Reason understands the notes, but loses the melody. True purpose does not reveal itself in calculation, but in resonance. It manifests when action and meaning vibrate in unison, when the simplest gesture contains the totality of presence. The soul does not distinguish between great and small missions. It recognizes only the integrity with which each moment is lived. Fear arises when the mind tries to define purpose with fixed words. It seeks absolute clarity, wants guarantees, wants control. But purpose is fluid, changeable, like the field that sustains it. It redraws itself as consciousness expands. What once seemed the central objective may dissolve when a new vibration is reached. Therefore, purpose is not discovered. It is revealed in the rhythm of surrender. And this revelation does not happen through seeking, but through listening. While material logic demands proof, the field asks for trust. The fear of not fulfilling purpose is, in truth, the fear of not trusting the very movement of life. The mind fears that, by letting go of control, everything will be lost, but the field operates in the opposite way. It is precisely in letting go that alignment occurs. Life is not organized by coercion, but by resonance. And when energy returns to its natural flow, purpose begins to emerge spontaneously, without effort. The true goal is not to find a destination, but to sustain a state of consciousness capable of creating meaning at every moment. This does not mean passivity, but attunement. When action arises from inner silence and deep listening, it becomes an expression of the field. Each gesture, however small it may seem, vibrates in coherence with the whole. In this frequency, purpose ceases to be an unattainable point in the future and becomes a present experience, a state of connection between the human and the quantum. Fear, then, loses its function. It dissolves when one realizes that purpose was never outside, waiting to be conquered, but always inside, waiting to be remembered. The field does not impose tasks, it offers possibilities. Consciousness chooses, and the choice resonates back as a path. The doubt that so angers the seeker, what if I never discover my purpose, is merely a distortion of perception. Purpose already manifests in every act that is born of presence. Even in gestures the mind considers insignificant. Material logic tries to measure the value of life by visible results, but the field measures by vibrational coherence. When the being lives in tune with what feels true, the universe responds with synchronicities, flow, encounters that seem to be guided by a subtle intelligence. These signs are the field's language confirming alignment. Fear dissolves not through the conquest of certainties, but through the direct experience that life's flow knows the way. Purpose is not a prize, it is a vibration of belonging. It reveals itself when consciousness stops asking, "What is my mission?" and begins to feel, "How can I be present?" At that moment, material logic loses strength and the field takes the lead. Life ceases to be a race and becomes a dance. The pain of uncertainty turns into curiosity, and fear becomes reverence. Purpose is not the end of the search. It is the way the seeker becomes the path itself. When the being finally understands that purpose is not reached, it is embodied, fear dissipates like mist in the sun. The mind, freed from the need to prove, begins to hear the rhythm of the field. And in this living silence, consciousness realizes it was never late, never lost. Every step, every mistake, every wait was part of the invisible choreography the field had been weaving from the beginning. True purpose then reveals itself as simple and absolute, to be the vibration that allows life to keep creating itself through us. There is a moment when the air seems to change density, and something imperceptible begins to move inside. It is not a grand event, nor a noisy revelation. It is almost a whisper, a vibration that runs through the body like a thread of ancient memory. The mind does not understand, but the heart recognizes it. It is the instant when the soul begins to remember, not with words, but with resonance, the link that has always existed between itself and the quantum field that sustains all reality. This remembrance does not come from outside. It emerges when the noise of the search gets tired of itself. The soul, exhausted from trying to understand the universe through logic, returns to listening to it through feeling. It is a return to the vibrational origin, to the point where there is no separation between observer and phenomenon. Everything that seemed distant, the invisible that reason classified as abstraction, suddenly becomes tangible in subtle sensations, goosebumps, warmth, an inner movement that precedes thought. Energy responds to attention as if it were alive, and it is. The lost link is, in fact, the thread of consciousness that connects us to the unified field of all possibilities. For ages, humanity forgot it by choosing the safety of the concrete. Life became a process of repetition, and the sacred was reduced to belief. But the field was never absent. It merely waited to be heard. And when the remembrance begins, the being realizes that every emotion, every choice, every glance was a constant conversation with this energetic ocean that surrounds them. The awakening of this link does not happen all at once. It reveals itself in fragments of perception, a coincidence that repeats, an intuition that is confirmed, a feeling of being in the right place without knowing why. At first, the mind tries to rationalize. It seeks explanations, theories, proof. But no word can translate what it is to feel once again part of the whole. The soul knows that something has aligned. The vibration changes, the body relaxes, and life begins to respond with a different rhythm, more fluid, more coherent, more alive. In this state, time loses rigidity. The past seems to draw near, the future softens, and the present expands. It is as if the field, once recognized, reorganized the perception of the real. Everything gains the shine of interconnection. Chance disappears, replaced by a silent synchronicity. The universe seems to breathe together with the one who awakens, and each breath becomes a dialogue between the visible and the invisible. Consciousness ceases to be a spectator and assumes its role as co-author. But this remembrance does not come without resistance. The mind, accustomed to control and linear logic, tries to discredit what it feels. It questions, sneers, sabotages. It is fear of the unknown disguised as reason. However, the more the being tries to deny it, the more the field insists. It manifests in dreams, in signs, in emotions that cannot be explained. The soul, patient, keeps whispering through experiences. You were never separate. The reunion with the field is an experience of vibrational reconnection. It is not necessary to adopt specific practices, only to cultivate presence. The field responds to the degree of consciousness, not to spiritual performance. When one observes the world without defense, the field begins to reveal its living structure. Things cease to be just things and become extensions of the same energetic organism. The plant on the windowsill, the sound of rain, the gaze of a stranger, everything begins to take part in the same silent conversation. This remembrance changes the way one acts. Decisions cease to be born from fear and begin to emerge from listening. There is a clarity that does not come from reasoning, but from intuition aligned with the field. It is as if the soul, upon recalling its connection, returned to operate in coherence with the original matrix of life. The body responds with lightness. The mind, even without understanding, feels safe. Energy flows in spirals, and existence comes to be experienced as movement, not as effort. The lost link is found again in the instant when presence replaces haste, when the gaze lingers on the simple, when the breath is felt from within, when listening becomes deep enough to perceive what vibrates between words. It is in this living silence that the field manifests most clearly. It does not arrive. It has always been there, awaiting the recognition that activates it. What changes is not the field, but the frequency of the consciousness that finally perceives it. Remembrance also brings responsibility. By understanding that reality responds to inner vibration, there is no longer room for victimhood or indifference. Each thought, each emotion, each gesture takes part in the creative web. The universe is not a static backdrop, but an organism that responds to the way we observe it. The link with the field is, therefore, an alliance of conscious creation. In this moment of remembrance, the being does not go back to what they were. They become more whole. Fear dissolves in the perception that there is no real separation. Life ceases to be a sequence of accidents and reveals itself as choreography between energy and consciousness. What once seemed distant and mystical becomes the simplest and most concrete foundation of existence. Everything vibrates, everything responds, everything participates. And when this perception settles in, a natural impulse to share arises. The field's vibration is amplified when it is recognized collectively. Therefore, if this remembrance touched something in you, if at any moment you felt that silent resonance that seems to come from a place outside of time, write in the comments, "I remember the field." Leave this phrase as a vibrational record, a meeting point between consciousnesses that have begun to recall. And, if this content resonated in your heart, like the video so that this frequency can find others who are also ready to remember. Because each individual remembrance awakens the memory of the whole, and the field responds always to those who decide to remember. The true battlefield is not in the world, but in the invisible interval between the mind and the heart. It is there that the human being splits, trying to reconcile two ways of perceiving reality: the mental, logical, sequential one that seeks to understand, and the cardiac, intuitive, vibrational one that simply knows. This silent conflict is the point where the remembrance of the quantum field confronts the structure of the ego. The mind, accustomed to translating everything into cause and effect, tries to reduce the energetic experience to the language of reason. The heart, however, connected to the field, speaks in pulses, images, sensations that do not obey linearity. Between the two, the human being oscillates, divided between what they learn to believe and what they are beginning to feel as truth. The mind was trained to protect, not to liberate. Its original function is to filter stimuli, organize information, ensure survival. But over the course of evolution, it became a tyrant. It came to believe that control is synonymous with safety. Every time the field tries to manifest through intuition, synchronicity, or a creative impulse, the mind raises its defenses. It wants proof, guarantees, logic, and not finding them, it declares, "That's just imagination." But the heart insists. It beats, sends signals, awakens sensations that escape reasoning. Life, at that point, becomes a tense dialogue between the reason that wants to maintain the known and the soul that longs for the unlimited. The conflict between mind and heart is not an error, it is a stage. It marks the moment when the human being begins to expand beyond the boundaries of habitual perception. The quantum field cannot be grasped by the analytical mind because it is dynamic, paradoxical, and simultaneous. It contains multiple possibilities coexisting, something that challenges linear thinking. Therefore, when the heart tries to reveal truths that come from that space, truths felt and not thought, the mind reacts with fear. Fear is the natural resistance of the old system in the face of the imminence of a new frequency. This tension manifests in many ways. Intuition points to a path, but logic soon questions it. The impulse arises to change something in life, a job, a relationship, a belief, and immediately the mind builds arguments to stay where it is. It is the movement of the field asking for expansion and the rational structure trying to preserve form. In this clash, the body feels the impact: anxiety, insomnia, fatigue, a tightness in the chest that is not physical but energetic. The entire organism takes part in the conflict because it happens in all layers of the being. The heart does not speak in words, it speaks in frequency. It translates the field into sensations, into small evidences of coherence. When a choice is aligned, there is lightness. When it is not, there is contraction. This is the language of the soul. The mind, on the other hand, operates by comparison. It analyzes the past, projects the future, and, in this dance between memories and expectations, loses the now, the only point where the field manifests. Therefore, the balance between mind and heart does not require the submission of one to the other, but integration. The mind needs to learn to serve the heart, not to command it. The conflict ceases when the mind becomes an observer rather than a judge, when it stops trying to prove and begins to witness what the field reveals through feeling. At that moment, thought reorganizes around a new coherence, less based on material logic and more guided by the vibration of inner truth. This transition is delicate because it implies detachment from certainties. The mind fears losing identity, but what is lost is only rigidity. What is gained is a new kind of intelligence, vibrational intelligence. Quantum physics describes something similar: particles that behave differently when observed, revealing that the observer takes part in the creation of the phenomenon. The heart is that subtle observer within us. It does not interfere through analysis, but through presence. When attention shifts from fear to feeling, the field responds immediately. Probabilities reconfigure, and reality begins to reflect the new vibrational state. The mind, when it allows, becomes an instrument of this harmony. It begins to decode the invisible into coherent words, ideas, and actions. But as long as the ego insists on commanding, the being will live in duality. The heart points to the infinite, and the mind clings to matter. This friction produces suffering, but also creative friction. It is through it that consciousness matures. The turning point occurs when suffering ceases to be interpreted as punishment and comes to be seen as a sign of energetic misalignment. Pain, in this context, is the difference in frequency between what the mind believes and what the heart knows. Integrating these two poles is the true act of inner alchemy. When the mind surrenders to the wisdom of the heart, it does not disappear. It expands. It becomes a channel for the field to express itself lucidly. Thought ceases to be noise and becomes a tool of conscious creation. The heart, in turn, ceases to be an abstract territory and becomes a precise compass. The being comes to live in coherence, experiencing life as flow rather than effort. In this state of alignment, conflict gives way to listening. The mind and the heart begin to vibrate in the same field, and consciousness becomes a bridge between the two. Life organizes itself from this silent harmony, where each decision is born from a balance between rational clarity and intuitive wisdom. The universe responds in synchrony, and what once seemed confusing reveals itself to be simple. The remembrance of the field is no longer intermittent. It is constant, stable, tangible. The conflict between what the mind believes and what the heart tries to reveal is the rite of passage from the old consciousness to the new. It does not need to be won, but crossed, because the instant both recognize themselves as parts of the same field, the being awakens to a new perception. There is no division, only different ways of vibrating the same truth. And then, what was once struggle becomes dialogue, and what was noise becomes music, the quantum symphony of expanding consciousness. The body perceives before the mind. One day, without warning, something inside begins to tire of the invisible struggle to keep everything under control. The breath grows short, goals lose their luster, and a silent exhaustion occupies the space that was once driven by will. It is not weakness, it is a sign that the energy has reached the limit of sustaining a way of living misaligned with the field. In that instant, even if the mind still resists, the soul already understands. The time has come to let go. Surrender is not a dramatic gesture, it is a return. Life ceases to be a territory to be conquered and becomes a flow to be felt. What once required effort begins to happen by resonance, not imposition. It is as if reality, perceiving the inner truths, could finally breathe along. The heart, which until then only beat, begins to guide, and in the silence between one thought and another, there arises the feeling of being moved by something greater, an intelligence that organizes everything without noise, without haste, without error. For a long time, the mind believed that to surrender meant to lose. But surrender is not abandonment, it is attunement. It is the moment when the I ceases to be the driver and recognizes itself as part of the river itself. This shift changes everything. Fear, once constant, loses density. Time slows. The gaze becomes sharper. Reality, instead of oppressing, begins to respond. The energy that was previously spent trying to predict and correct the paths returns to the center. And in that center, a genuine power is born, that of allowing life to happen from within before it materializes outside. The quantum field operates by coherence, and surrender is the most coherent frequency that consciousness can emit. As long as there is resistance, the field mirrors noise. When control yields, it mirrors harmony. This harmony is not conquered, it is recognized, and recognition begins when the being allows themselves to remain in silence long enough to hear the rhythm of their own field. In this listening, the mind loses its monopoly on direction. Intuition begins to emerge, not as a flash, but as a constant compass. Surrender is a turning point in the energetic journey. Everything that had been sustained by the force of will begins to reorganize through the force of vibration. Connections that are no longer in resonance unravel naturally without pain. Opportunities that were blocked arise in an almost poetic way, as if they had always been waiting for the right frequency. The universe, at last, finds space to act. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but total presence. Surrender leads to that silence. The body relaxes, but does not fade. The mind slows, but remains lucid. In this space, everything communicates through vibration. The plant growing in the corner of the room, the wind that changes direction, the look of a stranger. Everything seems to contain a subtle message. The field begins to reveal that it has always been active, merely waiting for consciousness to listen to it again. When energy enters into flow, the sense of effort dissolves. Actions continue, but they are born from another place, from an inner center that does not know anxiety. Doing ceases to be obligation and becomes expression. Choices begin to spring from a calm clarity, and intuition begins to manifest as spontaneous movement. It is in this state that life becomes collaboration with the field, not a dispute with it. The being who surrenders realizes they were never the isolated creator of their circumstances, but the channel through which the field manifests in human form. This realization does not diminish, it expands, because true freedom does not lie in commanding the universe, but in dancing with it. Surrender is that dance, the step in which the human and the quantum meet in perfect synchrony. Letting go is not the absence of direction, it is allowing direction to arise from the center, not from fear. It is trusting in the precision with which the field adjusts to our vibrational state. When that trust matures, the improbable ceases to seem like a miracle and becomes natural. Everything begins to happen at the right time, in the right measure. The universe responds to surrender with an orchestra of synchronicities that confirms in every detail that life knows what it is doing. The freedom that is born from surrender is not an event, it is a state. It does not depend on the absence of challenges, but on the presence of consciousness. What once generated anguish now becomes learning. What once seemed like loss reveals itself as space. The being learns to trust the interval between the waves, the place where the field creates, and in that space they find peace, not as a pause, but as a foundation. It is not the one who gives up who surrenders, but the one who matures. The flow of the field does not require effort, only authenticity. It moves with those who vibrate in truth, and that truth is neither ideological nor spiritualized. It is vibrational. It is the coherence between what one feels, what one thinks, and what one does. When these three align, the field opens, and life, in its radical simplicity, reveals that the path has always been less about doing and more about allowing oneself to be. Liberation is realizing that the field never needed to be conquered, only remembered. The moment surrender becomes natural, the being flows again, and the universe breathes in unison with them. Everything that was effort becomes dance. Everything that was fear becomes trust. The flow continues, and the being finally realizes that they have always been within it. The moment consciousness realizes that power does not come from outside is comparable to the first breath after a long dive. The air is the same, but the breathing is different. For a long time, the mind sought energy from external sources, recognition, security, love, stability, believing that the meaning of life depended on what the world could offer. However, there comes a point when this search becomes unsustainable. The accumulated emptiness reveals the truth that had always been waiting. Nothing needs to be brought from outside, because the field already pulses within. Rebirth begins when the being stops searching and decides to remember. This awakening is not explosive, it is silent. It arises like a breeze that crosses the body from the inside out, slowly dissolving the layers of forgetfulness. The quantum field, which once seemed like a distant theory, becomes a living sensation. It vibrates under the skin, reacts to attention, responds to emotion. The being realizes that each thought is a wave, each intention a vector of energy, and that reality is not something that happens, it is something that is emitted. This perception completely changes the way of existing. External dependence gives way to vibrational responsibility. The creator awakens within the observer. Inner rebirth is the natural consequence of reconnection with the field. When energy begins to circulate freely again, the identity built on the need for control begins to dissolve. The I that needed to prove its worth fades in the presence of something vaster. And what emerges from this dismantling is not fragility, but freedom. The soul recognizes that it was never separate from the whole, only distracted by the illusion of form. Infinite power is not a special gift. It is the essential nature of awakened consciousness. Modern physics describes that everything that exists is energy vibrating at different frequencies. The body, thought, and feeling all are expressions of the same unified field. What changes is the intensity and coherence of the vibration. When the human being understands this experientially, something reorganizes. Fear loses meaning because there is no longer outside and inside, gain and loss, beginning and end. Everything becomes an expression of a single creative movement. Rebirth is then the recognition of this unity, the conscious return to the flow of creation. In this state, power ceases to be an idea and becomes a living force. It does not manifest in grand gestures, but in small coherences. It appears in the clarity with which one responds to a challenge, in the silent peace before the unexpected, in the compassion that arises without calculation. The energy of the field is not theatrical. It is precise. It operates in the subtlety of gestures that do not seek applause, in the wisdom that needs no speech. The reborn being vibrates presence, and that presence alone transforms everything around. To renounce the old way of existing is not simple. The mind tries to rescue old structures, to offer resistance, to seek guarantees. Rebirth is also a death, the death of the character who believed themselves to be the owner of destiny. But this dissolution brings no pain when it is welcomed. It is the same movement as a seed that breaks open so life can sprout. The structure that dissolves creates space for the new vibrational pattern to stabilize. The field needs that space to expand its expression through the being. The awakening of inner power does not mean omnipotence, but harmony with the whole. The creator and the creation become inseparable. Intentions cease to be individual desires and become expressions of collective consciousness in harmony. When the being vibrates at this frequency, they become a catalyst for transformation. Their presence reorganizes environments, calms emotions, awakens memories in others, not through technique, but through resonance. The field recognizes those who vibrate in coherence and responds by amplifying the reach of that frequency. The energy that was once spent on resistance now returns as creative force. Ideas arise with clarity, synchronicities multiply, and what once seemed distant manifests naturally. The universe responds because the vibration of the being and the vibration of the field have become one. There is no effort, only communion. It is at this point that rebirth is consolidated, when life ceases to be a sequence of struggles and becomes a continuum of conscious creations. This power, however, is not to be hoarded, it is to be shared. The field expands through exchange. Each time someone awakens to their inner strength, the vibrational fabric of humanity rises. Individual rebirth is also collective, because the field knows no boundaries. By vibrating in coherence, the being contributes to the harmony of the whole. And that is the highest expression of power, to serve the flow, not to dominate it. The new consciousness that emerges from this process sees life as a laboratory of expansion. Everything, including challenge, is part of the experience of self-creation. Energy is not good or bad, it simply responds. What changes is the quality of the emission. The awakened being understands that to think is to emit waves, to feel is to shape frequency, and to act is to crystallize vibration. Thus, each instant becomes an opportunity to create reality with purpose and beauty. Rebirth is remembrance. It is the soul returning to breathe in rhythm with the universe. The body, once heavy, becomes light. The mind, once noisy, grows quiet. The heart, once divided, vibrates in unison with the field. And in this state, life regains its sacred dimension, not through religiosity, but through consciousness. Everything that exists is an extension of the same source, and the power to create it is intrinsically present in the one who perceives it. Upon discovering that infinite power has always been within, the being does not become more important, but more humble. They understand that their role is to allow the field to flow through them, not to control it. And the more they surrender, the vaster they become. This is true expansion, not to occupy more space, but to dissolve into the whole. Rebirth, therefore, is not a destination, but a continuous state of remembrance. The recognition that the universe is not outside, but breathes through every heartbeat, every gaze, every conscious gesture. It is in that instant that power reveals itself, silent, unshakable, infinite. Everything the mind sought outside has always existed within, silent, waiting to be remembered. The quantum field is not a distant mystery, but the living fabric that responds to every vibration of consciousness. When the being ceases the struggle, the universe reveals itself as an extension of its own energy. The journey does not end in understanding, but in experience, to live in presence, to create with coherence, to feel oneself as part of the whole. That is the true return, to recognize oneself as an expression of the infinite that observes, creates, and loves through us. If you have come this far, write in the comments, "I vibrate in the field," so we know you have completed this journey. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe to continue expanding with us in this frequency of consciousness and awakening.